started my fellowship 3 years ago. I also want to point out I'm the OG visiting senior fellow. Immigration was our very first topic, and I was so grateful that I had found a place that recognizes the importance of the intersection of immigration and national security and gave me a place to talk about it, anchored in our values, but in a very real, pragmatic, and actionable way. So immigration as a national security imperative. Heading into this election year, once again, immigration is one of the top issues and probably one of the most divisive issues that we are facing as a country right now. For more so than ever that I can remember, and I've been doing this work for about 20 years, we are seeing a very explicit link between immigration, national security, and border policy. And that conversation is happening through sound bites and headlines and 240-character tweets, but it is so much more complex and nuanced than that. So this panel, we are hoping to shift those perspectives and explore a little bit how immigration and border policy intersects and can enhance national security. Immigration is not just a border policy issue, regardless of what you might read in the news these days. It touches every aspect of our life in the US and abroad. It is something you deal with whether you know it or not. And we are hoping to examine the facets of that issue on all levels. We'll be talking about legal immigration, undocumented immigrants, and of course, all the humanitarian considerations that we're seeing at the border right now. Thank you so much for being here and being willing to embark on this journey with us. Our panelists are so impressive that I'm not going to read their bios because we would be here all that morning just doing that. But they are in the programs if you want to see them. But I'm delighted to welcome Secretary Caldera, a senior lecturer from Harvard Business School, former Secretary of the Army and advisor to President Obama, and currently co-chair of the President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration. Then next to him, Andrea Flores, the Vice President of Immigration Policy and Campaigns at Forward.us. Retired Ambassador Cindy Corville, the former ambassador to the African Union, and finally, Dr. Manuel Orozco, the Director of Migration, Remittances, and Development Programs at the Inter-American Dialogue. Thank you all for being here today. So I'm going to start by asking our panelists a series of questions aimed to sort of set the stage for the conversation we're going to have. Then I will ask them all a few panel conversations and encourage them to engage and agree and disagree, because that's also the point of this panel. It's okay if we don't all agree. We can have this conversation regardless, and we can all agree on what the outcomes are that we want in the long run. And then we'll open it up to all of you. So I'm going to start with Andrea. Andrea, if you could just maybe give us a little bit of the current challenges in U.S. border policy, especially at the U.S.-Mexico border, and immigration writ large.
Sure. So thanks so much for having me. Really excited to talk about what is one of the most maybe unpopular or popular issues to talk about in America right now. So the state of immigration policy. We are at, I think, a very fascinating point in this issue where the two political parties are looking a lot more similar on this topic of the border security, and the future of immigration than they ever have, really, since the post-9/11 era. The last time you saw this much unison was probably post-9/11. Immigration was seen as a national security threat that needed to be regulated differently. And now again, we're on year 4 of the Biden administration. You're seeing what will likely come next week as a formal shutdown of the U.S.-Mexico border, a shutdown of the humanitarian protection system, and a really tremendous change. So why are we here? How did we get here? I actually really like to start 10 years ago to understand the current moment, because 10 years ago, after the last 2013 comprehensive bipartisan immigration reform push, we saw the demographics sort of coming to the U.S.-Mexico border change significantly during the Obama administration. And we saw that the asylum system that had been designed in 1980 was sort of not equipped to manage that humanitarian sort of moment. And what Americans experienced at that time was perceptions of chaos, was a number of vulnerable people at the border and border communities. I grew up in a border community. It really felt like it was a changed moment. And it really, in many ways, those images, those perceptions gave rise to, I think, a much stronger immigration restrictionist movement that was channeled by President Trump at the time in the 2016 election. You can't really downplay what 2014, 2015 and border policies did to the politics. If we look back now, it makes a lot more sense than it did on the 2016 campaign. But now we, again, under the Trump administration, the public was really galvanized against the type of border policies Trump put forward, right? They saw them as cruel. They saw children in detention facilities that we had not seen really before in the US, tender age children, children under the age of 5, family separation, Muslim ban, and those were big public moments. And when you looked at the polls and where Biden was going into, when I joined the administration, the public was overwhelmingly supportive of reversing that, right? Of saying that isn't who we are, it does not align with our values. But then you also get into the shift of migration. We have 20 million people, over 20 million people displaced in this hemisphere alone, and we're dealing with the same immigration system that we've been dealing with since 1990, right? So those migration patterns that started in 2014 when people started to come, they intensified, right? Because it became a common path for people to take because they had no alternatives. And so there are no alternatives really to the asylum system for all of the displaced people I just named. And so we're seeing totally different migration trends and a system unable to adapt and a Congress also unable to agree upon how to update that system. So what does the politics of that mean? Less public trust, perceptions of chaos, feeling that no matter what the administration does, they're not getting a handle on the issue, and once again strengthening sort of immigration restriction and dropping out issues we used to talk about like DACA, the undocumented, and for the first time you saw an immigration bill that had nothing for the long-time undocumented be supported by Democrats fully and by some Republicans. So that's kind of where I think we are, which is a threshold moment and in a moment, an opportunity to, I really think especially for Democrats and non-immigration restrictionists to articulate a different policy vision.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for that. And so let's take an opportunity to drill down a little bit into all of these issues and especially why we should care, especially why this community should care. So Secretary Caldera, one thing that we don't talk a lot about is the role of immigration in the military, something that matters a lot to this community. So how does the inclusion of immigrants and immigration policy in military and defense sectors benefit America's national security?
Thanks for the question, Camille. Thank you also for being here and for inviting me to be with you today. It's a really, really important topic, and I've been in public life for a lot of my career and in higher education, and there's policy and then there's politics. And I work a lot in immigration policy, even though the politics aren't very good, because we have to wait for those moments when we have the opportunities to actually accomplish something, and at that point, having put forward policies that we've been thinking about, working on solutions. And sometimes we accomplish things through regulations, through lawsuits, through other kinds of ways when the political process is a little jammed up. So I work a lot on that on behalf of college and university students, undocumented immigrant, asylee, refugee, international students. On the national security front, obviously, I can go back further to the founding of our country. At that time, most people were foreign-born, and a lot of individuals came to assist our country. Kosciuszko from Poland, and Farragut from Spain, and Lafayette. And immigrants have been part of our military and have contributed in every one of our nation's wars since its founding. And have incredible acts of heroism and contributions. Often people who were not were challenged here domestically in terms of the vindication of their own civil rights or their status in the society, but when they put on the uniform, they went to fight for our country. We're actually living in a period today where we have among the lowest immigrant participation in our military because of policies that have been put in place to deter immigrants from serving. This is a problem because we're actually having trouble recruiting people to our armed forces. The Army, the largest service, the one I know best, that has the most individuals it has to recruit every single year, is having trouble meeting its recruiting missions. Interest in military service among young Americans is incredibly low. And yet, I know because I've talked to a lot of them, there are a lot of young men and women from immigrant families, particularly those who are undocumented, and therefore, because they're undocumented, they can't serve. You can't legally recruit someone into the military who doesn't have a status and a work authorization to be here, but who have said, I want to serve my country. They grew up here. They're dreamers. I put forward this idea more than 20 years ago. Why don't we have a transition process by which these young men and women who were brought here as children have the opportunity to normalize their status through military service. And we can leverage their desire to serve. I also know, because I'm a West Point graduate, I'm wearing our crest, a lot of our cadets at our service academies, they don't just want to serve in the enlisted ranks, they want to serve in the officer ranks. And they want to give back to the country that created this opportunity for their families. I was one of those. My parents were immigrants from Mexico. I wanted to serve my country. I wanted to serve in uniform. So let me give you an example of the kind of policies that harm our ability to have people serve in uniform. We've had people in uniform who have had deportations proceedings started against them because they enlisted under one immigration status, it changed, and the Department of Homeland Security doesn't talk to the Department of Defense, and so one part of the government starts an enforcement proceeding while the other person is deployed in Iraq or Afghanistan. We've had people serving in uniform in areas of conflict whose spouses, they start deportation proceeding against their spouses. By the way, one part of the government can't sue the other part of the government, so the government says, you're on your own to go get a lawyer, hire a lawyer, pay for someone to try to sort this out for you and for your family. That's not treating people the right way. We used to say, once you enlist, that you could get the naturalization process while you were in basic training. But by the way, you had to serve your entire enlistment to continue to be, to retain that citizenship. So you couldn't just do it and then leave. And the last administration zeroed out that program. We had a program called Military Accessions Vital in the National Interest to find individuals who had cultural competency, language skills that we need in our military because of our worldwide mission. By the way, we also need them in our State Department. And so if you had a status, it would allow you to join the military. And when DACA was created, there was a thought that DACA recipients would be able to serve in the military. A lot of them wanted to do it. And yet through policy decisions in the Department of Defense, that opportunity was zeroed out. And then in the last administration, MAVNI completely was zeroed out. And so our opportunity to access people with the skills that we need for our national security was zeroed out. So I'll end by saying immigrants today are about 18.5% of the U.S. labor force. They're about 5% of our military labor force. Okay, so if you just think about those numbers, there are a lot of people who would be willing to serve if we would open the opportunities for them to serve, and in serving, they would strengthen our military and our security in the world.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary Caldera. And so going from defense to foreign policy, Manuel, how can immigration help or be shaped by foreign policy in America?
Thank you very much. I think, the discussion of immigration and migration, as you say, is a complex one. It brings up existential issues because migration is about, to a large extent, defining the self and the other, who you are and who they are. But at the end of the day, if you are a nation of migrants, then how can you draw that line? And it becomes an existential problem. It's always been a policy problem and a political problem at the same time for many decades. There is also an institutional framework problem in the sense that although immigration policy falls within the jurisdiction of national security, alone is not the sufficient tool to deal with migration itself. You have foreign policy issues, you have defense-related issues that also fall into the aspects relating to migration. For example, the current migration wave that followed what Andrea was talking about from 2014 to 2012, the post-global recession initiated a global migration flow. And it accentuated just before the pandemic, but really exploded to the extent to which between 2020 and 2024, we have almost 12 million people arriving at the border. On an annual basis, it's 1% of the population of the United States. That's unprecedented, but it's not the same pattern. It's a pattern that is occurring globally the United States is not the only host that is receiving migrants. In fact, we still have 20% of the global migrant population today as it was in 1990. It hasn't changed because mobility continues to occur in a global landscape. But 16 countries that are arriving at the border come from nationalities from politically difficult countries. They represent 90% of the entire flow of people that are coming in. The HNV countries, for example, Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela, they are a particular category that belongs to serious politically difficult countries that are represent to some extent an existential threat to the US policy, the democratic values that we hold. We have the countries from the Northern Triangle, complexity of issues that are shaping the reasons why people want to migrate. They have to do with development. They have to do with rule of law. And then you have other countries that are challenging our national security, Russia and Ukraine. So 16 nationalities are fundamentally bringing into attention a foreign policy problem that is arriving at the border. That means that you cannot alone work with immigration policy because immigration policy is about three components: protecting the border, deciding who enters and who doesn't, and managing integration. That's what immigration policy is about. But it's not about addressing the risk factors of why people migrate. That's foreign policy, and that's where the Population, Refugee, and Migration Unit of the State Department has become one of the busiest agencies in the US government right now. So you need to understand with precision where the problem is coming from and how to tackle it. Why do we need to have a much more proactive foreign policy on Venezuela, for example, on Nicaragua, or on Cuba, that breaks out the foreign policy mutism that we're dealing with right now? There are serious problems in how our foreign policy has been basically captured only by problems with China. And the rest is like, well, mute. So you do need to have an economic approach accompanied also by a robust diplomatic engagement. And I think that those are some of the key elements that we need to consider when integrating the relationship between migration and immigration policy. You need to pair migration policy with foreign policy and with national security policies, with defense in particular, because some of the migrants, some of the people or the nationalities that are coming in, take, for example, the case of how Nicaragua is allowing the country for charter flights coming from nationalities that are unknown to the rest of the world, to the United States in particular. More than 200,000 people have arrived to Nicaragua who sees the United States as an enemy to come to the US border in a matter of 1 year. And these nationalities represent a challenge. If not, you might have some threatening issues. So you need to pair those three elements together and then find the policy responses for each of these nationalities that you're dealing with.
Thank you. And Ambassador Corville, bring us home. How does this all tie together? How does all of these foreign policy concerns, national security concerns, especially when we're thinking about dealing with countries, as Manuel just pointed out, that are politically unstable and are driving a lot of migration here?
Well, no, my panelists have really explored a breadth. Instead of my ambassador hat, I spent 4 years at the National Security Council. So policy, I will start with the need for an effective and all-encompassing policy because immigration and national security is political, economic, social, defense, security, but today, as you talked about migration, climate change, all of these things impact. And so it is fundamentally important to develop a policy that addresses those broad issues. Caldera, thank you so much. You talked about the conflicts of one agency not talking to the other. And that depends on an administration, how you make it talk to each other. So I happened to be at the time at the NSC, the Special Assistant to the President for Sub-Saharan Africa. But I also understood that I had to talk to defense, and I also had worked in defense, so I understood the language. So I found myself being a translator. So if we're going to translate immigration, we have to talk about the political impact it has on us, the economic, the labor force that we probably need, some by choice and some who are undocumented, but a labor force that we need nonetheless and utilize and don't always acknowledge the significant contribution that it makes to our economic well-being. And so you have to consider actionable policy. You can't do everything. Part of our whole political system is that we change from one regime to the next. That means you need to have legislation that makes it permanent. It also means you need to have a functional Congress, but that's a whole nother discussion that we're not going to get in. So I see three major levels: the strategic role and impact and how to define immigration, the operational, how do you put it into practice, and then in using military terms, the tactical. So yes, we need them at all points. We are a nation of immigrants. We don't teach our history to our own people. So if you start at the very beginning, it depends on which ship you came on. And that discounted the people who were already here. So when you start to look at it in that context and understand that immigrants are fundamental or of strategic importance to the creation of what we know as the United States of America, and hopefully the continuing of the United States of America, and I'm trying not to go down my negative path here. So it is so important in the interagency process how we talk about this, the language, translating what state means by one term to what DOD and what commerce means, and what DHS means, Homeland Security, which is a whole nother component, and the legislation that allows us to go across. But this starts at the White House. And if the White House doesn't take the lead to construct a comprehensive policy, and it's challenging, so I'm not putting blame, but it means even within the White House, you have to talk to each other and have the conversation. So, competition for resources happens between the interagency. Who has the ability? DOD has almost more money than God. So state borrows from DOD, and DOD knows they're never going to get paid back. So you have to have an integrated policy. Reality, we cannot take everyone. So I like what you talked about, the issues that we're dealing with immigrants or undocumented immigrants coming from other countries. We have a responsibility, like it or not, to be one of the beacon in terms of that shiny, city on the hill, to be what we need to do in terms of other countries and policies. You cannot afford to let Ukraine fall. You cannot afford to let Sudan. So there are people who aren't coming from the Sudan, who have been displaced. I was in Darfur back in the 2000s, and the same tragedy is still going on today. The same refugees and displaced people are in those same camps, and that's horrifying to think about that. Haiti should have never fallen. That was a failure of U.S. foreign policy from day one because we failed to recognize it. So we have to go back and look at the historical context. But the policy is not just about an immigrant coming in. What are their contributions? And also, how could you make it possible for them to live in the homes that they were living in? Because most of them don't want to leave their countries. And so, unfortunately or fortunately, the United States has that responsibility. So, competition for resources is going to be critical too. And educating our own American populace to remember, only a handful of people were ever indigenous to this continent. And so what is an American but an amalgamation of multiple different groups of people?
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you all for that. So we're in a room full of doers. We don't like to just talk about things around here. We like to, stand up and do something about it. So to the panel, let's start. And you all sort of started hinting at this, but in the context of the growing instability around the world right now, how do we design an immigration policy that supports our foreign policy objectives and our international alliances? I'll open it to the panel.
One thing I think is that there's a part of this, if I could add just one more element to the discussion. You may know, but our country, our birth rate is below replacement level. So in order to have a strong economy, we need to have immigrants who are coming in and joining we have to have open doors for immigration. Also, 85% of the graduate students in AI are foreign born. 60% of those in computer science, mechanical engineering, all sorts of technical fields, graduate students, are foreign born, and most of them want to stay here. Some of them want to go back because they see great opportunities in India and other places, but many of them want to stay here, right? So this is real, and that is also part of our national security, because these are the people designing everything from weapon systems to how do we secure our computer systems, et cetera. So we are a little schizophrenic as Americans. On the one hand, proud to be a nation of immigrants. On the other hand, a xenophobic view that raises its head from time to time. And I think those of us who believe that immigration is a net plus for our country need to speak out when we hear those things and at times like this. But I think no one's talking about open borders. No one, right? But but we need an immigration system that works, that deals with the reality of our times, which is that there's going to be climate migration, that there's the greatest number of displaced people in the world, and that has entry points for people to come in, and that has investment and cooperation internationally so that fewer people feel those push pressures to come back. I think we can design that. I think people of goodwill from both parties can figure this out if we can lower the temperature on the corrosive dialogue.
I think on the labor force side, it has to be multi-tiered. Yes, the intellectual to develop AI is important, but we also need at all levels, whether it's from the fields to the White House, and it needs to be honorable at all levels and people taken care of there. So I lectured to a group of seniors, those who are 20 years older than me. So they tell me I'm a youngster, so I'm liking this. That I said, you don't want your grandchildren to work in the field, okay? So who do you think is doing the work? It is honorable work to work on the farm, to produce the food, to provide for the needs of the nation. And so, I will date myself, you probably have heard of John Deere, but you haven't heard of International Harvester, who, I'm an IH girl because my father worked for International Harvester in Louisiana, so I was used to riding on the combines. My siblings all worked in the fields, and we were born here. I'm the only one who did not in a generation of 4 children. So understanding that it is not just at the most high intellectual level, that doesn't mean that someone in the field isn't intellectually capable, but there almost is a joy in the farming and the production. So I hope we take into consideration that we have to be very specific, because unless you're going to mechanize with AI, which means you're going to displace a whole lot of people in the fields and other places. And I've seen that mechanization and the negative impact.
Thank you. If you don't mind, I'm just going to move us on because I want to make sure we have time for questions. But maybe to Manuel and Andrea, given the divisive nature of immigration in the public debate right now, how can policymakers and influencers communicate the foreign policy and security benefits of generous immigration policy to a skeptical public?
I'll just start on the pure politics of it. We need pro-immigration surrogates again, and we need them ideally to come from the Democratic Party and the White House, and for there to be an alternative narrative. We don't have that, and that really worries me in the context of this election year, because there's no case being made why there is any foreign policy or national security consequence to Trump's immigration agenda. There's no case being made as to what are potentially the dangers of the U.S. shutting down its humanitarian protection systems. And there's really no one looking at, so let's just talk about the upcoming shutdown of the border. So for a political reason, it feels really compelling, right? It's something that Americans understand. They say, it's gotten out of control. Can you pause it? Can you just make people stop coming? That's not the way the law works. It's not the way, I'm a former DHS person, that CBP processes people. It's not the way, we don't even have the facilities to turn people away at the rate you would need to close down the border, because we've never built that infrastructure on the border, because we've never really had a coherent border security policy, right? So we're starting there. And when you look at the arguments for or against shutting down the border, what I look at is also, what are these authorities that are being used? And it's a 212F authority that not only was the basis of something like the Muslim ban, but it was also the basis of far less covered pandemic restrictions that impacted the entire legal immigration system. So we saw under the Trump administration 212F to justify banning international students, legal immigration categories. It could be expansive, and if you strengthen the national interest arguments, right, you could see how we're sowing the seeds for something that we don't want. But if we don't start doing some positive arguments as to why, like, we need immigrants, and that no party is saying that, I'm really, really concerned about what that means for rural population decline. Vermont is formally a state in rural population decline. And what I find, I'll take the cities situation, right? That's another we've never thought about what it means for new arrivals to integrate into cities, how they get there, what their integration is like, mainly for asylum seekers. So that's a federal policy failure right there. And I point that out because even while that was happening, you had the mayor of Erie, Pennsylvania, you have the mayor of St. Louis, you have the governors of Utah saying, we would love to welcome some of these new arrivals, we need them. But there was no federal or political mechanism to get people there, to reorganize. And so instead you're seeing these acute situations in New York, Denver, Chicago, and I'm sending to policymakers back when I was in the Senate and in the administration, I'm like, wait, I found another mayor who, if we could just figure out how to do this. So we really need all of you to feel compelled in some ways to provide some of that counter narrative, because once again, if you just look at the pure political campaign messaging, that's not gonna get us to a place, to the policies that we need, and we have to bring down the temperature, and we have to remind Americans why they do benefit, and that can get hard because I come also from the border communities, and I want to say I shouldn't have to justify this person's presence in a way, but we do have to hold Americans' hands in some way and say, this is why we still want this system, and this is why we want it to work. And I'm very passionate about, like, this is why I want a process of the border to work. Because as a border community member, the city's crisis has been our reality for a very long time. And it just wasn't in New York City, right? And we've been asking for the same federal policy solutions. So I'll just say, I'm sort of trying to recruit all of you to help bring down the temperature and provide some pro-immigrant arguments.
Thank you, Andrea.
A lot of these issues have to do with accountability. 2/3 of Americans actually think that migration is a good thing for America. And this has been going on for more than 30 years consecutively. If you look at the Gallup polls on opinions on immigration, 2/3 of Americans think it's a good thing. And only 1/3 of Americans think that immigration should be reduced at the current level. There is disagreement as to how immigration policy is being handled. And I do agree. I mean, I'm among those who think that, is really fucked up. Let me start with this. The State Department's second foreign policy goal is democracy. The first one is national security. But we are not complying with our own goals when it comes to the foreign policy objective of addressing democracy worldwide. So someone has to hold the administration accountable over that. Someone has to hold, Andrea talks about narratives or counter-narratives. Somebody has to hold accountable the rhetoric of immigration as a problem in Congress. Because it seems to me that Congress is the one that is talking about one thing when the people, the American people, are talking about something else. So where is the disconnect? Well, we're near an election, so we must hold people accountable over those issues. And at the same time, it's important to hold accountable all the policy establishment and give them some tools too. For example, when it comes to, you mentioned many times the issue of the labor force, that we need workers, etc. I don't know if you know, but for example, only 4% of the US labor force is in construction. Half of that labor force is foreign-born. So, the people who are helping to build equity through your real estate investments are actually people like me, migrants. So, we build your homes, and yet we are demonized. But what's interesting here is that the mechanism to bring labor into the United States, not in agriculture, because agriculture is only 1% of the total population in the labor force. But people under the H-2B visa category, it's only 60,000. It went up to 70,000 after fighting so much with this administration that they needed to change that. So there is a huge disconnect, and a lot of it is, I think it's more than a narrative issue. It's more about being informed and informed about the policy priorities when it comes to the labor force and why it does matter. I mean, domestic work, that's another example. More than 2/3 of domestic workers in the United States, nannies, babysitters, etc., are foreign-born, female foreign-born workers who have no labor rights, none whatsoever. Because once you enter into someone's privacy of your home, you don't have labor rights. So, we do need to have an informed thinking about how to deal with migration, both in terms of the integration process, but also in terms of the risk factors that lead people to come. Andrea was talking about asylum cases. There is a very strong correlation between the 16 nationalities we talk about that come to the border and the nationalities that are applying for asylum. There is a positive correlation. It's people from El Salvador. More people have migrated from El Salvador, for example, during the current government of Nayib Bukele, who he called himself as a cool dictator, than in the past 30 years. And we say nothing. We eliminate sanctions to dictatorships. Why? Because we're afraid more people will migrate. Actually, the opposite is happening. The lower your sanctions, the higher your migration rate is taking place. Case in point, Venezuela. We didn't have migration from Venezuela until basically 2020. Now it's more than 1 million Venezuelans that have come here because they have nowhere else to go. So we do need to have a holistic approach to these issues.
Thank you. And I do want to leave time for a question. I know better than to be in a room full of Trumans and not give you guys a chance to talk. So I would like to ask, we have danced a little bit around the economic security implications, and I did want to name that because that's an important point, and I'll get more to that at the end. But I would like to give every one of you an opportunity for final thoughts, 30 seconds each. I'm looking at the clock, and then we'll open it up to questions. Secretary Caldera, let's start with you.
Yeah, I addressed some of those economic issues, but I want to, you should go to the Niskasen Center and look at their evaluation of the proposed Trump immigration plan. It would be devastating to our economy and devastating to our national security. There are a lot of things that are being proposed that are counter to what our country stands for.
Okay, it's hard to pick, but I'm going to second this idea of the comprehensive sort of vision on immigration policy. I'm very concerned that Republicans have successfully reduced it all to like whether we should have an asylum system or not, and it's so much broader than that. And they're winning, and right, they cut out DACA recipients, foreign students, like every single other group we've talked about. And I only see one party and one probably group putting forward that combined foreign policy domestic vision, because there's nothing set up in government right now to actually execute that, as you said, unless the White House pushes it. So I really think civil society is going to have to like lead on this one and how to give a more compelling foreign policy domestic sort of urgency to figuring this out.
Thank you.
And I would, echo that too. What are the policy objectives? What are the end goals? What is doable? What is the timeline and an integrated policy strategy? There's enough brain power in this room and online. I will challenge you to write the policy, and it has to be bipartisan. Things will shift from one party to the next. But I think that reality is that we have to have goals that are doable and a timeline. Pick the top 3 you think you can get done during an administration, and that was one of the things we were taught. What can we do now? And you have no policy without funding. It's just pretty words on a page. So you have to have the money. Think PEPFAR with HIV/AIDS, $15 billion. We knew you had to have the money or it wouldn't happen.
Thank you. Manuel, last one.
I think we need to look at the things that have worked. One of them is we need to have like a bipartisan task force on migration and immigration policy, led, housed by the National Security Council, but with a broad set of members that are outside Congress. We have had that before. Barbara Jordan led one of these task forces before, and I think it works. It helps you shape your policy on migration from the more comprehensive set of this, and we don't have that. And with the polarized Congress that doesn't want to make legislation, at the very least, they should appoint a bipartisan task force on immigration that will last for 18 months, beyond the current administration and the next one.
Thank you all. All right, True Fam, let's get to work. We got some work to do. We've got some questions. There's mics on either side. Okay. And we're going to start with our Truman doer-in-chief, Sean Van Diver.
Write that down. Trip, do you hear that?
Don't get me in trouble with Trip.
Why change? Hi, folks. My name is Sean Van Diver. I lead Afghan evac. We've been working extensively with the administration. And Andrea, everything that you just said is right. Everything all of you said is right. Yesterday, we were at a meeting with the White House making the exact case that you just said, saying, help us get the word out. 89% of the American public support Afghan relocation and resettlement. 70% of evangelical Trump supporters support this. And we said, hey, can you help us? And they said, pitching is really hard for us. And then 8 hours later, I got a text saying, hey, can you help us get the word out on the Welcome Corps? And I wanted to throw my phone in the fucking ocean. So I agree with everything you just said about integrated policy across the enterprise. And they don't talk, they're not talking. So I agree with you. How can Truman help? How can Afghan evac help? How are you being received at the White House when you're bringing these questions to bear? And who can we just heard a conversation about picking up the phone and saying, hey, dude, we have a lot of connections at the White House. We have a lot of connections across this government, a lot of Truman members in significant offices. What can we do to pick up the phone and say, hey, dude, who should we be talking to, and how can we support you, and what has been the reception?
Yeah, I'll try and take that one. So I am a former Biden admin alum, and I did leave the administration around sort of concern about the vision broadly, and being concerned that we would get to a point where we were not articulating this sort of justification for why our immigration system still needed reform. And so I've tried a number of tactics, some, more critical, and some, I think in the last year and a half, something I think it has been helpful is actually doing, and Truman can do this too, there are a number of really creative and novel things this administration has done. Welcome Corps is one of them. Operation Allies Welcome, as many mistakes as there were, it completely transformed the way we receive new arrivals. Did you know there were 70,000 people temporarily housed? At the same time, we had an emerging cities crisis, but that the federal government was housing, matching, coordinating with civil society in a way we never heard of, saw, and it was Afghan arrivals, right? I find that fascinating. I find it fascinating that they were able to, we talk about border processing. Take what happened with Haiti, Del Rio, if you remember 2021, the images of over 10,000 Haitians there saying we couldn't process them, we needed to expel them, there was no way to do it. 3-4 months later, 20,000 Ukrainians at the San Diego border. And I saw tools move that I never thought were possible to move. I saw a port of entry be open that had not been open in 3 years. And I saw this engagement, once again, with civil society to find solutions to this federal problem. So what I am trying to do is remind them, I'm like, you've done these, creating the Uniting for Ukraine is incredible, creating the parole pathways for CHNV, that has been the most sustainable policy that has actually reduced unauthorized migration that I have seen since we've been in this modern migration trend. You don't hear that from the administration, though, right? You hear we still have to shut down the border even if we've reduced unauthorized migration by X percentage. They have the lowest borders numbers right now that they have had during this presidency. You don't hear about that was a foreign policy push with Mexico. So I am actually trying to tell their story, and I find at least like if all of us can tell a story and say there is this vision, I find that's like an effective way. And to remind them, you know, if I can create a resource that shows, look at the progress you have made, I'll do that. If we can like use our voices to sort of articulate when maybe they may be hesitant. And I want to say, I understand why they're hesitant. I see all of the internal polls on this issue. They are very scary. You see Americans supporting mass deportations. You see them naming border security, but if you think about that, what does that even mean to the voter? And I think we have to get into that because I don't think it necessarily means all one thing about asylum. I think they just want to see a system that functions.
Can I just jump in on that, on the answer to that question, because the question was, what can we all do? One of the things we're trying to do in the higher ed world is just build a broader-based coalition, right? It's got to include the faith-based organizations. It's got to include American Business Immigration Council, the business community's interests. It's got to include the tech community's interests. It can't just be the traditional immigrant advocates' rights organizations. And anything difficult that's been done in this country legislatively was done by a very broad grassroots coalition. And we have to make it safe for moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans to solve this problem. And so unfortunately, part of what also needs to happen, which I hope and I'm sure you're probably involved in, is democratic reform so that we don't have these incredibly polarized districting plans that send people for whom compromise is an anathema and is the thing that results in you being primaried in your next election. The hallmark of the legislative process was always compromise, and we need to get back to that.
Thank you. We've got Aaron, and then Tim, and then, I'm sorry, the light is right in my eye, but the last three questions. So Aaron, go ahead, and then we'll go that way.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for being here. Aaron Brennan, Truman, San Diego. My question is this. You're in charge for a day. What's the first thing you fix in your sort of respective areas? You get to write the policy, you get to make the rule, whatever. What's the thing you do for one day? You're in charge. What is it?
I get the legislative leaders in the room, and I say we're not leaving this room till we have a solution, right? Because you can't get there without the votes. And so I want to make them do the work. I was an elected official. I think there are people who are in public life to solve problems. There are other people who are in public life to do partisan warfare. Keep those people out of the room. Get the ones who want to solve problems in the room and leverage what they know is the right thing to do, and then support them.
I'd say before you get to that, the White House has to write the policy. So if the policy is this is the group, the three groups we're focusing on, these are the three political economic needs that are most salient and important to our national security. You define that, and then you say it's doable. And the earlier question, corporate council on malaria. As the NSC rep, I helped organize 20 energy companies and NGOs who for the first time sat in a room and disclosed how much money they were paying on malaria, what they were doing, and still exist today. So it didn't belong to a party, and then work with Congress to get the appropriation, because policy belongs in the White House.
Yeah. Tim?
Thank you all very much for this panel. This has been a tremendous discussion. My question is for all of you, what are some of the lessons that we can learn from policy failures around Dreamers, around DACA, that we may ultimately end up having to apply to these large populations of humanitarian parolees who may risk being in legal status purgatory, in perpetuity if we don't sort of address the, sort of the long-term consequences. Obviously, we need humanitarian parole, but what sort of medium to long-term future can we offer folks who are very unlikely ever to return back to their home countries? Thanks.
Okay, I'll try. I'll say it was a major mistake to leave DACA out of the latest Senate negotiation, right? It was months of not talking about the undocumented, and it gave permission now where that's the starting point, and that's what reform looks like. And I want to say their inclusion of the Afghan Adjustment Act, those things are really important in that bill. But if we did not talk about even DACA, the most bipartisan popular category, we are in trouble. So I'm very worried about the temporary status question. What I found from my time in the Senate, though, is that there is no political pressure right now on Republicans to even have a stance on DACA, to have a stance on parole recipients, to ask them what they'll do with Ukrainians. And so there does have to be that bipartisan civil society work too, right? So there's very few bipartisan immigrants' rights organizations, and that historically kind of makes sense, but we kind of have to get back to getting commitments right now. Parole reform is probably in our future. Parole has become a stopgap because we haven't created new visas since 1990. That's really unstable. When I think about what I do in a day, I'd create all of these different visa categories. But if we don't start bringing it up in the debate and reminding people, I think there's something, like, if we lose DACA, which you probably will in 2025, there's going to be an estimated 1,000 people losing, like, being pushed out of the workforce every day. Add people who have parole, and that's going to go up. Every single day, employers are going to be losing thousands of workers in a labor shortage economy. That story has to be told right now during this election, but also we have to be going to Tom Cotton and different Republican senators and saying, how are you going to stabilize this population?
There are 500,000 DACA recipients. They're probably going to lose DACA because of a decision by the Supreme Court. So that's sort of the future we're facing. No child graduating from high school today is eligible for DACA. It was time limited. So for several years now, all of those undocumented students, 75,000 to 100,000 a year, are graduating without the benefits, even of DACA, as limited as it was. What we hear when we go talk to senators and members of Congress is, we really care a lot, but we can't do DACA until we've done border security. And so that linkage, and honestly, you're not going to do DACA if the well was poisoned. So if we don't create that narrative, and if we don't create that safe space for moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans to be able to do some thoughtful things, then even if they wanted to, they can't do it because of the backlash that they would get. So we have to create that safe space.
Thank you. And I just want to get to our last question.
Hi, I'll try to make it very quick. First, wonderful opportunity to be here. I'm Tahina Montoya, part of the newest class of 2024 Defense Council, and just really excited to be here. Thank you so much for the mention of Operation Allies Welcome, which I think was a huge example of how we can apply lessons learned to this very topic. And I also wanted to make a plug for bipartisan policies that do have allocated funding, like the Global Fragility Act, that could be leveraged to address these issues. But my question is, is there any countries that are doing it right, or any countries that we can pull lessons learned from? I recognize that it's unique, every country is unique, and the circumstances are different, but how can we leverage policies that are currently out there globally on an international scale to see what it might look like for the U.S.?
Manuel, do you want? Oh, I'm sorry.
No country is doing it.
Sorry, Manuel.
But it's not because they don't want to. I mean, here we want to make things right. The polarization aside, the major problem in the U.S. Establishment is moral risk, moral hazard. People are not making decisions and living to inertia. The future of DACA is going to be the same as it is today. It's not going nowhere. And there is one country that took the risk to make sound policy decisions with migration, and that's Colombia. And they developed a whole strategy of integrating, regularizing Venezuelan migrants. They are now the first largest minority in Venezuela. There used to be Afro-Colombians, now it's Venezuelans. So there is a little bit to learn from that. But my best recommendation is, let's look at what Barbara Jordan did that led to the immigration reform, the last immigration reform. And second, what Silvestre Reyes did on border security, Operation Hold the Line, that helped to really improve the border management. And there are success cases. They are both based on bipartisan accomplishments. But you do need other actors, think tanks, different sectors, the business sector. I mean, there is a much more broader community when it comes to migration today that is not the same that it was 30 years ago. And we have to be realistic that you need that. But you need to basically mandate and entrust in them a decision of set of checklist issues, DACA being one of them, but it's not, I mean, you have DACA, you have TPS, you have the parole, the humanitarian parole problem, because it's not a solution. It may look like a solution in the short term, but it's not. And then provide a blueprint of what the 21st century immigration policy should be.
I think one of the things that we have done right is that we actually assimilate immigrants have historically very effectively. And the fact that we have things like birthright citizenship and free public education regardless of your immigration status means that people who came here regardless of their circumstances could thrive and contribute. And I think the worst thing we could do is demonize immigrants as they're coming to this country. Can you imagine if you're a young Muslim man and the message is, you are welcome here, you can create a future for yourself here, you can provide for your family, or if the message is, you're not welcome here, we suspect you of being a terrorist, we're going to try to deny you and try to force you out, or not even ban you from coming in. So I think it's hard. It's not easy. It is not easy being an immigrant. There are a lot of bumps and bruises on the way, but the first generation can create opportunity for the next generation, and their kids end up in college, and they end up giving a lot back to our country.
Again, we're at time, so unfortunately, but maybe we can continue this conversation during the break and outside. I just want to, first of all, I want to thank all the panelists for being here this morning and engaging in this lively conversation. I want to thank the Truman staff. You guys, it is not easy to pull off this incredible event year after year, and they really just deserve all of our applause, all of our thanks. I want to thank the policy and program team, especially John, Max, Chris, and all of the fellows for giving me the space and the encouragement and putting up with my nuttiness while I explore these topics in maybe a slightly new way, but a way that is energizing nonetheless. And if you want to hear more about what Truman is doing on immigration, we have a great panel tomorrow that's being co-led by Sunil Varghese and Denise Bell on migration in the Americas and the LA Declaration, which is specifically about how we support cities managing migration. We have a lot on our website, including our framework paper, white paper on how to talk about immigration as a national security imperative. We're currently working on a toolkit, to Andrea's point, about how to get cities to work better together to promote better and more inclusive policies. And we have the return of our San Diego trip. For all Truman members, you're eligible to apply. Please, please, please apply. It's an incredible opportunity. It's 3 days at the border. We go to Mexico. We meet with folks on both sides. We get to see all the sites spearheaded by our cultural chaperone, Sean Van Diver, who's about to do a dance for us in his seat. And it's all expenses paid. Well, we pay for airfare and accommodations and most of the meals. So we hope that you'll apply for that. And please stick. And yeah. We'll talk about Tijuana later, Sean. So we're heading into a break, and then please come back. One of our very own, Secretary Buttigieg, has filmed some remarks for us, and you don't want to miss them. So we'll see you all back here in 10 minutes. Thank you.